Disclaimer, I am going to try and be as vague as possible with this story. It makes it a lot harder to tell, but I don't want to risk anyone bothering any of the people involved. Also, don't read into the footage on screen. It doesn't have anything to do with the game or games I'm talking about. This is a story that boils down to two things: power hoarding and caring about the wrong things. Trust me, it'll make sense in the end. Well, maybe it'll make sense in the end. I started speedrunning a game, let's call it Game A, and tried submitting times to its leaderboard. There were a couple moderators for it, and unfortunately, both of them had been inactive for months and didn't respond to direct contact. Then I submitted a time for two other games, let's say games B and C, both of which had one of the same mods from Game A's leaderboard. The same thing looked like it was going to happen again, until that one moderator suddenly became active again and placed the times on the leaderboard. This particular mod had a time on the leaderboard from several years ago, but was not the original founder of the board. Instead, the person who did create it left, and they inherited the mod position by default. With them having run the game before, one would think the leaderboard would be maintained and they'd be at least somewhat informed about the game. Unfortunately, this did not seem to be the case. Even at a glance, it was apparent they either didn't know or didn't care much about the game. The image that was supposed to be the cover art of the North American release was actually a screen grab of the cover of the Japanese instruction booklet. Not even the Japanese cover art, the Japanese instruction booklet. The posted release date was wrong, and so was the list of platforms the game was on. The one speedrun category for the game was not for the mode of play that used an in-game timer. This kind of behavior wasn't an isolated incident, as on a couple other leaderboards this moderator was in charge of, the release date for one game was wrong by over 10 years. Another game didn't account for a laundry list of unlockable cheats that could be turned on, and yet another didn't use in-game time, even though there was a clearly visible on-screen timer throughout the run. This all paled in comparison to their worst offense. On one board they moderated, they had specific rules in place saying the game had to be played on the default difficulty. This moderator's verified time on said leaderboard started by showing them dropping the difficulty to the lowest setting and adjusting other settings that were clearly against their own rules. I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well, but I tried to take the high road and be diplomatic about things. I contacted this moderator about some of these problems, and they said that they weren't very knowledgeable about the game and would fix some of these issues when they had time. That seems fair, until you account for three things. One, where this leaderboard was being maintained, it was possible for moderators to appoint other moderators to help maintain things. I offered to help in this capacity, since I was more well-versed in the game from both a general knowledge and technical standpoint, and was turned away. They would not add any other moderators, even given their lack of knowledge of the game. Two, the fixes I pointed out were things that took seconds to do. At one point, I became a moderator for a completely new board, so absolutely nothing was set up. Getting everything together, the cover image, the release dates, the platforms, the rules, setting up a category, all of that took me about 10 minutes. This moderator was someone who would stream on an irregular schedule to a small audience, and would do so for several hours at a time. said streams included things like speedrunning RPGs they'd never played before. RPG speedrunning can already be time-consuming, much less when you've never played the game. That aside, the third thing to consider is just how long these fixes took to ultimately not happen. Aside from one recommendation, the easiest one to implement, the bulk of these fixes went completely unaddressed for 5 months. I don't like nagging people to do things, but I felt like I was doing that with this moderator, even though I was only bringing it up maybe once every month or so. Eventually, runs appeared on the leaderboard which appeared to be cheated, or otherwise used factors outside of the game itself to go faster. At the very least, they were the impetus to updating the rules or adding a new category to account for what the players were doing. Instead, the moderator considered this to be legitimate speed tech and refused to do anything about it, on top of the various other things they weren't doing. All of these things I mentioned, in my opinion at least, are not the behaviors of a moderator, but of someone who only cares for the status symbol of being a moderator, and they're not letting anyone else help comes off, in part, like a dragon guarding a pile of gold, not willing to let anyone near it, even though said dragon has no use for the gold and no idea what to do with it. Near the end of those 5 months of inaction, when a different person asked the moderator about a timing rule I'd suggested changing multiple times before, he suddenly showed interest in changing it, but ultimately didn't. Seeing that this moderator's behavior was alienating other potential runners, that was when my frustrations hit a breaking point. Around that same time, when someone else who was trying to do a run asked why some parts of the leaderboard were the way they were, something I'd pointed out to the moderator 5 months ago, I publicly responded saying it was that way because the moderator hadn't changed it yet. I will admit, that was a dick move on my part, but it was also one born out of months of frustration with and inaction by the moderator. This was around the time I started receiving several personal messages from the moderator about how I'd, quote, never get what I want, unquote, and how I was lording my knowledge of the game over them. Imagine being a moderator of a game's speedrun leaderboard whose response to someone who knows a lot about the game is to shun and ridicule them. They also tried downplaying the situation by saying there weren't many people who ran the game. I might argue that a poorly maintained leaderboard with only one harder-to-time category and absent moderators can drive runners away, but that's a whole other argument. Since reasoning with the moderator clearly wasn't an option anymore, I decided to go over them and to let's call it a universal moderator. Someone who can make administrative changes and settle disputes across different leaderboards. I was told to create a list of things that needed to be fixed and show it publicly to the moderator, specifically noting that I'd be willing to help implement them and allow time for the moderator to see it and act or not act on it. Basically, I was told to do what I'd already done privately, but in public. A week after doing so on the game's message board, and the moderator clearly being online during that stretch, nothing had changed. The universal moderator then contacted the moderator directly about what was going on and... well, I woke up one day to find the old moderator gone, and myself appointed as the new one. I don't know what that universal moderator said to the old moderator, but from what I was told, the old moderator immediately added me to the leaderboard and demoted themselves. However, they didn't make sure to have a head moderator for the board before doing so, which led to the universal moderator appointing me to that role. 20 minutes later, every suggested fix was implemented on the leaderboards. Timing issues were resolved, and a couple new categories were added. Perhaps as a result, more runs from new runners started appearing. There's a concept called the Peter Principle, where a person who performs well in their role gets promoted until they aren't competent enough to do their job anymore because their abilities don't match what the next job requires. This could be seen as an extremely abbreviated version of that, going from runner to moderator. While it might sound nice to be a leaderboard mod, not every runner is going to be able to handle it. Something anyone in this position, or any position of power, needs to be able to do is adapt to and embrace new information and acknowledge where their understanding of their responsibilities is lacking. You can know what you know, but it's also important to know what you don't know. New information is not a threat, and treating it like one can and will backfire. And to end on a thoroughly blunt note, being a mod doesn't automatically make you special. If you get all high and mighty and demand that people kiss your rings, don't be surprised if someone takes a hammer to them instead.